Hey everyone, today I wanted to discuss some more perks that completely failed in their purpose. Perks that were to fulfill a role, but ultimately just don't achieve what they were aiming to do. They aren't necessarily all going to be bad either, they just fail at what they are meant to be. This is just my opinion, of course. Really, perks don't have a designated purpose. So this is of course always up for debate, whether they do fulfill their role or not. This time around we're looking at killer perks. Beast of Prey is debatably the worst perk in the game. This perk activates after entering Bloodlust. Upon doing so it gives you the undetectable status so long as you keep Bloodlust. It fails on a few levels. One is that some killers simply can't acquire Bloodlust well, making the perk often never really activate. Second, and the bigger issue, is that this perk fails in the thing it is trying to do, which is give you some stealth when in chase. The perk is already on a short timer, with Bloodlust only lasting so long as you require it before catching the person, which is inevitable. You're not going to be able to use it to full effect for stealth, because if you do, then you're going to drop chase, losing the effect. If you stay within a chase, the only thing you're really doing is removing the red stain, which is at best situationally useful. A perk that encourages stealth, but if you decide to use it, you're probably going to lose the effect. Deathbound fails partly by being too complicated in its design. Figuring out how to use it effectively takes quite a bit of effort for what is a tiny return in value. This perk activates after a survivor heals another at least 32 meters away from you. The survivor who does the heal will scream. The perk then activates for 60 seconds. If the survivor who healed then leaves the radius of the person they healed, they become oblivious. The other issue with this perk is I don't really get what it's meant to be going for. Whether it wants to disorient a survivor, whether it wants to provide information, I'm not too sure, but it doesn't really do any of it well. The scream can give a general location, but being 32 meters away means that the killer often can't exactly get there efficiently. Then to add the oblivious status when they inevitably leave their radius also doesn't do much, with the survivor having the head start and the killer being unable to tell who the effect is even applied to. This is where it fails for me, is that you can never really tell who the perk is affecting 99% of the time. It may allow for some additional stealth, but ultimately it likely won't do much. This perk fails its already unclear purpose by simply overcomplicating its own activation and disallowing the reward to be acted upon. Dying Light is a perk that aims to slow down the action speeds of the other side. The main issue here is that it also actively works against itself. It provides specifically the Obsession with a 33% boost to repairing, healing, and sabotaging. This effect is permanent so long as they are alive. The whole perk in fact only works if the Obsession is alive. Each time you hook a survivor, you gain a stack which equates to a 3% reduction to action speeds, stacking up to 11 for a negative 33%. This is applied to the other 3 survivors. This reasonably means that you need at least 4 hooks before the perk even begins doing its job of slowing down the other side. In fact, up till then you've actually sped them up through the Obsession. This will be even more noticeable with a good Obsession player who's able to make the most of this bonus. You may think, well, tunnel out the Obsession, but then of course the perk stops working. It's a really backwards way of this perk functioning. Once the perk is up and running, for the most part you're only really adding a second or two for heals, and a little over 10 seconds for gen speeds. Not bad, but often at this point in the match, when you have those higher stacks, the game is usually at a point where you're going to win, or the survivors are done with generators. The negative side effect is rarely useful at this point. Predator is an odd perk that aims to help you track better. This perk alters how scratch marks appear, changing them to be narrower. This perk I'm not entirely convinced is bad exactly, it's just that scratch marks are an integral part of gameplay, and when you change how they appear, and how we know them to appear in regular gameplay, this change is often just a detriment, unless you were to, say, run this perk all the time, and eventually get used to the difference. The narrower scratch marks often make tracking harder. We learn to follow the more erratic and regular scratch marks. They can go up on walls, they can scatter about, but with Predator they're typically narrowed to the floor, and often so narrow that they can be a little hard to follow in certain cases. If the area is crowded or the floor is obstructed, this perk can become an active detriment to tracking, because it's too precise to the survivor's pathing. Shattered Hope is a weird perk, and a perk you've probably never even used. This perk was added, but it was added kind of at the end of the reign of the boons, when boons were just okay now and not overpowered. This perk simply breaks a totem when you snuff a boon, instead of just extinguishing them, disallowing for the boon to be placed again on the same spot. Problem is, it came a little late, and so solved a problem that wasn't really there anymore. This is a unique case of a perk failing because its intended purpose just doesn't really reinforce its existence to begin with. A perk so pointless kind of that even though the perk literally does what it's meant to and counter boons in that sense, it's just not necessary anymore. This is evident from its usage stats. If you go onto Nightlight, a pretty good site for seeing perk stats, you'll see this perk never got over a 2% use rate, being the least used killer perk currently. No one requires this thing, and so ultimately I think its purpose to counter the usage of boons has ultimately failed. Grim Embrace is a perk that sounds really good on paper, but in actual play I think fails. This perk activates after you've successfully hooked each survivor at least one time. Once this happens, all generators are blocked for 40 seconds, and you see the Obsession's aura, which is a little weird, but hey. This perk to me is meant to stop generator progression at around the midpoint of a match, slowing down teams. The issue with it is, it often doesn't go down this way. It's actually quite an unpredictable perk despite its seeming consistency. There are times when you just won't find each survivor in a perfect order and hook them one by one. It's actually quite unlikely, and most of the time inefficient. If there's that one guy you can't catch, you can't use the perk, which feels like the opposite of what it wants to stop is efficient teams from getting too far ahead. It wants to reward fair play, but ultimately by playing fair, it can sometimes disallow you to actually activate it. The second reason this perk fails, I think, is because the downtime and the stoppage of generators often just doesn't do much for you. Unless you're in a chase, survivors are just going to hide, maybe heal up, regain some composure and get back in the match 40 seconds later with nothing changed, making it a very bizarre perk. Not bad in this case even really, but I do think a failure in its intended purpose. Unnerving Presence is definitely a debatable one, but one I do want to include. This perk makes it so when survivors are within your terror radius, they get 10% more skill checks and a 60% smaller skill check zone. This is meant to stop survivors working on generators or healing when you are close by and approaching. This in itself is a pretty flawed mechanic because for the most part they're going to stop anyway. They don't necessarily need this extra reason to. It's also a debatable negative side effect, with many being comfortable with hitting skill checks. Providing more and with a great precision needed often allows survivors to heal or repair faster in some cases. The perk to me tries to fill a role that is largely filled through normal gameplay, but then it further gives pitiful effects that can be debated to actually help the other side in the thing it is trying to stop. Therefore, I think it fails ultimately. Alien Instinct is a perk that reveals the aura of the survivor furthest away from you for 5 seconds, and also applies the Oblivious status onto them for 20 seconds. This fails because, for one, if the survivor is far away, a 5-second duration of their aura is not going to help much when they have a bunch of time to move. They're also going to be put on edge by the fact that they're now oblivious, likely forcing them to move or at least be further away. This means the goal of giving you a sneaky approach and a clear location kind of just doesn't happen because the perk somewhat works against itself. If it gave you undetectable and revealed the person for 10 seconds say, it would maybe be pretty effective for a longer but sneaky attack. The way it is now though, I can't say it does that at all really. Genetic Limits is a perk that fails its purpose because its purpose is just a bit pointless. A little like I mentioned for Shattered Hope. This perk makes it so when a survivor finishes a healing action, they become exhausted for 32 seconds. This fails because often survivors who are healing are safe, and so this effect will do near to nothing. The only way this perk is really going to come into effect is when returning to a hook or something, and finding 2 people, chasing the healer. There's way too many things though to cause this perk to actually halt any exhaustion perk, especially because it likely activates away from the action. 32 seconds may seem like a lot, but it's really not when you're away and safe. Sure, it nerfs you, but it nerfs you in a position of likely safety and doesn't do enough to endanger you, like revealing your aura, making the negative effect easily manageable. Dark Devotion is a weird perk, but a very cool one. When you hit the obsession, you apply your terror radius onto them for 30 seconds, and get the undetectable status. The purpose of it I think is to give you some stealth, but equally to distort or distract the survivors. Often what happens though is that the sudden appearance of a terror radius when a teammate approaches as a survivor is going to just put you more on edge. From their perspective, they now know that you have Dark Devotion, and so are now going to keep their eyes out for a sneaky approach. The fake terror radius on the survivor also doesn't do much, because people can suss it out simply by looking toward the survivor carrying the radius, and quickly deducing there is no threat. This is even more evident because it can only happen to the obsession, making it predictable. So for me it kind of fails on all fronts. It doesn't really make you stealthy, it doesn't really confuse the other side, and it rarely provides an advantage as a result. Alright, well that's gonna do it. I do hope you enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts too on these perks, and any you would add into this list that I missed. Thanks, and goodbye.